Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if your gambling habit is linked to other habits you have, especially if you are struggling with more than one thing? This new study dives deep into that question for people seeking help with drug and alcohol use. So imagine this, a lot of people who are trying to quit drugs or alcohol also struggle with gambling. But it is not always obvious how these things are connected. We tend to think of gambling and alcohol as a pair. But what about other substances, especially when people are dealing with a mix of things? That's exactly what our researchers wanted to figure out. They looked at a large group of people entering treatment for substance use in Australia. The big question here was this: does how bad someone's gambling problem is relate to whether they use other drugs besides alcohol? Does it link to specific drugs like methamphetamine, or is it really about alcohol after all? To get answers, they looked at the intake information from over 9,000 adults. They used a special kind of analysis to see how different substances and gambling severity were connected. Gambling problems are pretty common when people are already dealing with alcohol and other drug issues. Some studies suggest that between 10% and 43% of people in substance use treatment also have gambling problems. That is a huge overlap. But here's the thing: researchers often study gambling and substance use separately. And when they do look at them together, a lot of the research focuses on alcohol. This makes sense for the general population where alcohol is super common, but for people in treatment, they're often dealing with a whole mix of serious substances. And that is where this study really shifts focus. Evidence points more consistently towards stimulants like methamphetamine. Studies have shown that people struggling with cocaine or methamphetamine often have higher rates of gambling problems. Australian research also suggests that drugs like methamphetamine track gambling problems more closely than alcohol does. But what they haven't been able to do is untangle if methamphetamine is the key player on its own, or if it is just part of a bigger picture of using multiple substances. Is it the methamphetamine itself, or is it the fact that they're using a whole bunch of things? This study builds on previous work by the same team that found that when people use 10 different non-alcohol substances, it often forms one general pattern of polysubstance use. Alcohol, interestingly, didn't fit neatly into that pattern. It stood apart. This previous finding is really important because it gives them a framework to ask new questions. So, their main goal was to see if gambling severity in people seeking AOD treatment was linked to this general pattern of non-alcohol drug use, if it was specifically linked to certain drugs, or if alcohol was still the main driver. They wanted to see if gambling problems were part of a shared substance use pattern, focused on specific drugs, or still centered around alcohol. Okay, so how did they do this? They gathered information from over 9,000 adults who were seeking help at drug and alcohol treatment centers. This information was collected when people first came in for treatment. They made sure to focus on people who had gambled in the last year because that's when they could measure their gambling severity using a standard tool called the PGSI. For substance use, they used the well-known questionnaire called the WHO Assist. It helps them figure out how severe someone's use of different substances like cannabis, methamphetamine, cocaine, and others has been in the last 3 months. They categorize this use into no use, low, moderate, and high. And for gambling, they use the Problem Gambling Severity Index, or PGSI. This is a 9-item questionnaire that asks about gambling problems in the past year. The scores are put into categories: no risk, low risk, moderate risk, and high risk, which is basically problem gambling. The cool part of their analysis was how they put it all together. First, they confirmed that the 10 non-alcohol substances really did group together into that single polysubstance pattern they found before. Then, they used a statistical method called ordinal logistic regression. Think of this like a fancy way of predicting an ordered outcome in this case. The different levels of gambling severity, they put in the general polysubstance score, the individual substance use levels, and alcohol use to see what predicted gambling severity the best. They also did some checks to make sure their results were reliable. So what did they find? Out of the 9,421 people who gambled in the past year, the average age was about 36, more men than women were in the sample. For substance use, methamphetamine was super common, with over half the participants reporting recent use. High-severity alcohol use was also reported by a good chunk of people. When they looked at the non-alcohol substances, they confirmed that they indeed formed that one strong polysubstance dimension. Alcohol, as expected, loaded very weakly on this dimension, meaning it really did stand apart from the others. The strongest connections were found between methamphetamine and GHB, opioids, and sedatives. And cocaine and MDMA, which makes sense as people often use these together. Now, for the juicy part, what predicted gambling severity? In their first main model, the general polysubstance factor was linked to higher gambling severity. This means that using a mix of non-alcohol drugs in general was associated with more severe gambling problems. But they wanted to see if any specific drugs stood out. And guess what? High-severity methamphetamine use showed the strongest connection to gambling severity. This was after they had already accounted for the general polysubstance use. This means methamphetamine had its own special link to gambling problems, even beyond just using multiple drugs. Then they added alcohol severity into the mix. And here is the kicker: after accounting for the general polysubstance use and the specific substance effects, high-severity alcohol involvement was not significantly associated with gambling severity. Low and moderate alcohol use were actually linked to lower odds of gambling severity, which is a bit counterintuitive, but likely reflects that the reference group was people with no recent alcohol use who might be using other substances heavily. So the main story is this: gambling severity in this group wasn't primarily about alcohol. It was linked to the general pattern of using multiple non-alcohol drugs. But most powerfully, it was linked to high-severity methamphetamine use. The researchers really drive this point home. They say that the way gambling problems show up in treatment settings is different from what we see in the general population. Alcohol, which gets a lot of attention in general gambling research, didn't turn out to be the main driver here once you looked at the whole picture. Instead, it was high-severity methamphetamine use within that broader non-alcohol drug use context. This is why their findings are so important. They explain why typical assumptions like focusing on alcohol might miss the mark when treating people with complex substance use issues. The general polysubstance pattern did matter, showing that using a mix of drugs is linked to more gambling problems. But the strength of the methamphetamine link was surprising. They found that gambling severity wasn't just following the general polysubstance pattern. While the general pattern was associated, the specific link with methamphetamine was much stronger. It was like methamphetamine was the star player, even within the team of other drugs. So, what does this mean for us and for people working in treatment? The researchers are very clear: don't only screen for gambling problems if someone is using methamphetamine. Gambling harm is still common and can be missed. However, they say that high-severity methamphetamine use and complex drug profiles should definitely make clinicians pay closer attention to gambling severity. It means looking at the whole picture, not just the primary drug someone is using. The study also touches on why this might be happening, suggesting shared vulnerabilities like impulsivity or reward sensitivity might link methamphetamine use, polysubstance use, and gambling. But the main contribution here is mapping out how these things are connected at the start of treatment. Now, like all studies, this one has its limits. The data was collected at a single point in time, so they can't say for sure that methamphetamine causes gambling problems or vice versa. They just see that they're linked. Also, they measured substance use over 3 months, but gambling over a full year, which can sometimes make associations a bit weaker. And importantly, the study focused only on people who had gambled in the last year. So it doesn't tell us about people who don't gamble. Plus, the analysis didn't include gender-diverse individuals in the main statistical models because the group was too small. So we can't be sure these findings apply to them. They also mentioned that the way they use statistics like forward selection is good for exploring, but it doesn't necessarily mean one thing is more important than another in a cause and effect way. And using factor scores, which they did to represent the general polysubstance pattern, can sometimes make the associations look a little weaker than they might actually be. So to wrap it all up, this study gives us a really important piece of the puzzle. For people in AOD treatment who also gamble, their gambling severity isn't mainly driven by alcohol. It's more closely tied to using a variety of non-alcohol substances, and most strongly to high-severity methamphetamine use. What this means is that when people are seeking help for substance use, especially if they're using methamphetamine heavily or have a mix of drug issues, it is super important for clinicians to think about gambling problems too. It's a reminder to look beyond just the primary drug and consider the whole person's struggles. This research helps us understand these complex connections better so we can offer more targeted and effective help. What do you all think about these findings? Does it surprise you that methamphetamine was such a strong predictor of gambling severity in this group? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science simplified, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into the fascinating world of the human mind. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.